nhớ trong đã nói của hoa nhẹ cả trong xe đã tao tuần chỉ này là hoa sợ cho nó nếu đã của là nhảy ra đã nên và cũng mất sau kia một lần về hưu hay tiệt lần thường ban tế ra đã nên là tuần ý thọ chờ nên sẽ là con kế là gì nó cụ tiếp lệ. The chamber was filled with an eerie glow as the fire began to die down. Ntxhi Laim was lying on the ground with her dress torn from the back, bleeding from the whiplashes she'd received just moments ago. Her father's body, still warm, was already whisked away by the guards by order from her stepmother. She hadn't been able to say goodbye, and she would never see him again. The hot tears that came down her cheeks was burning her alive as she tried to move her body to make sure she hadn't been paralyzed. The punishment had been harsh, and although her stepmother said 20 lashes, the guards ended up giving her 30 because she tried to fight them. The sound of the dungeon was something she never thought she'd live to hear. She'd been born with a silver spoon in her mouth, and now that her father had taken his last breath, she was about to find out how cruel the world outside was. Her father, Lord Sahai, was a man of honor, known for his love to the world. His first wife, Ntxhi Laim's mother, had died from illness a decade ago. He'd remarried Paki into the mansion, and she'd been the mistress of Sahai Manor, but she and her stepmother had never formed a liking to each other. Her father knew that much, and he tried to send her away to boarding school, but he had run into money problems and couldn't afford it. So she'd been kept home where her stepmother treated her like a guest. But as long as her father was alive, she knew she'd be safe. The fear was when he took his last breath, which had happened, and now she was facing the harsh treatments from her stepmother. The door opened and Becky walked in, her stern face carrying a hatred so deep that it made her walk with an unstable stance. The woman wasn't kind to the eyes and looks, and Ntxhi Laim always wondered what her father saw in her. She gestured with her hands, and the guards all left the room. Cái sao đến chơi của chị cái nhỏ giả lý thương xài hót tài nó bỏ. Nếu nói cái gì đó có mà kỳ lạ, cái yếu kia yếu tô là chia của tớ mình. Becky said with an awful grin on her face. Ntxhi Laim shut her eyes for a moment before she opened them again. Cô yên bảo để cô lý xe hờ nhỏ lúc trẻ nó chỉ mua bé chơi nữa là. Sẽ cái sao tô của chị tô cầu tô kia. Cô mà toàn trong lòng có biết rằng tế để sẽ bị đi cả. Ở gì tôi họ tô xí lỡ lìa. Becky let out a disgusted sigh. Cái chỉ mua khó là hai lý có được của là Ntxhi Laim. Chỉ ta lên đó xứ tô có xứ nhau nhị thao là. Cô chỉ sao cả cô tế lo con cha ná. Cái kia của có trâu chỉ tình cầu cha. She moved her eyes to where the woman stood with a smirk on her face. Cơ yếu ở đó chị. Becky bent down and smiled at her. Tại kỳ lúcนู้tớ tôi thì cái gì bóc cả chân. Mà nói mà cơ cái tao bự trong hồ lúc trẻ nó. Cứ sao mà cái chi thon thon tê xe cái tụi mình lần niệm màu đen tao bây giờ bắt tao có là sữa nhỏ. Chị linh đỡ chị cái gì mà cái đi kia. Cái nhà ba đã chỉ là cũng những chuyện trái có ba chị. Ồ lý cái hay tu là bỏ tê là nó. Giờ thầu cơ tụi luôn yếu trong một hai block hành tu. Yếu cái tụi nước xếp hẹn nữa con. Becky laughed and she stood up. Cái sao tiệt của những trai à? Đã tê kia sẽ chỉ học là na. Cứ chúng mua khởi yếu họ có chúng mua khởi yếu sứ sợ. Giờ thầu cơ lúc vào lúc trẻ nói yêu của tình của tu. Ntxhi Laim felt hot tears slip down her cheeks. Sao cụ chỉ bỏ ra chuyện đó cơ, cụ chỉ thấy là yếu cái là open nhỉ. Lúc nào cụ chỉ tu mua lợn trên nữa tu luôn xe để chỉ tao bỏ cái lên trước một phen nữa có lợi. Becky knelt down and slapped her across the face. Cái chuyện kia chả cụ chỉ做cái gì á? Ntxhi Laim spat into her face. A mixture of saliva and blood stained her stepmother's gown, and she stood up, brushing it off, making a face. Jay mua cái nâng, she cried. Tú gì? Giờ nữa chỉ tôi chỉ mà chỉ ở chủ kia. The guards came in and unrolled the chained whips. Ntxhi Laim watched as her stepmother's expression held nothing but victory as she curled her hands into fists to bear the pain that was about to come. The sun was hot as the crew members got ready to set sail. The wind was in their favor, and Captain Ntxhi removed his hat to look up at the scorching sun above him. He was finally going to return home after 7 years at sea. This was going to be a great reunion for him. His dark eyes held an impatient expression to embrace his mother and sister. He was a dashing young man, and although 7 years at sea had him away from home, he had never forgotten who was important to him. Placing his hat on his head, he turned around just as a dark, tall man entered the ship. He had long black hair with almost black eyes, and he held several papers in his hands. Ntxhi knew instantly the man was a slave trader by his looks, and sure enough, a group of men who had their ankles chained together followed through. But the last man was carrying a woman over his shoulders, and her feet were also chained. Ntxhi walked over and raised his hands, and the group came to an abrupt stop. "Yelon Ntxhi," the slave trader said as he smiled. "Ya mo ta mung da chi." Ntxhi eyed the woman and then turned to the slave trader. "Ya olija." Turning to glare at the woman, the slave trader laughed and then turned to face Ntxhi again. "Ya la, chi mo da chi o. Tự do nữ tận giao mình chỉ chỉ yếu hại thế đi trột xí sư. Thầu cũng một thể nhẹ cho nó lo nếu như chỉ nhạc ali nó lợi. Ntxhi walked to the woman and lifted the black strands that hid her looks. Beneath it was a face with dirt and tear-stained cheeks, but if cleaned, would be a beautiful young woman. He looked at her hands, which were free of callus, and then looked up at the slave trader. Laughing, the slave trader replied, "Ye có chính trên của lò của những gần đóng đợi của yuan lò cho cái sai là những tàu cơ mà. Ye lò, tới tuần sai khai trong lý nó xứ chỉ nhỏ có là chơ chọ. Cú chơ vì có tư thọ của cho có một có chơ chơ. Giờ là chỉ tới mạng xứ của chỉ yếu có." The slave trader put up his hands in defeat. "Thọ mà lò, ye lò. Cú cho lùi tiệt của những chỉ phụ có một tấm mừng. Cơ bà bảo để luôn con nó một tí bát xứ năng xứ. Ye cú chia cái cho tí thứ bát nhỉ lên nó lò đó hồ luôn con nó. Thầu giá món tu yếu ở đó số lên số tu tranh kỹ." The slave trader smiled. "Cú bảo khó có hại trong cơ ye lo. Để chỉ cú cho lùi của những chỉ phụ có một tấm mừng. Giờ chỉ một tấm mừng tiệt của mà muốn nương bỏ đó để chống mũi chỉ lì." Ntxhi glared at the man and then replied, "Có nhớ trong cái chỗ lúa." He nodded and gestured for the group to pile in. Ntxhi watched as the woman was carried off with her hands and feet dangling. The movement of the ship caused Ntxhi Laim to jerk awake, and the pain from her wounds made her regret turning to her back. She let out a soft cry and pushed herself to a sitting position where she felt as if her back was about to break in half. The room she was in was small, dirty, and had a foul smell. A pitcher to relieve herself was in the corner, and no bed was in sight. The motion told her she was moving, and probably most likely on a ship. The door to the room opened, and the slave trader from last night smiled at her while holding a plate of bread and a cup. He kicked the door closed and walked in, setting the food on the ground before her. "Nó chỉ chua, mà nó có trong một tủ luôn có. Giờ có sao tao mà nó về cái chiếc hoa lửa, trái chỉ về cũng một cái chỗ lên trên nó nè." After he said this, he left quickly. Ntxhi Laim picked up the cold bread and ate quietly, her tears running down her face. She picked up the cup to drink only to spit out sour milk. Coughing, she brushed her hand against her mouth and used the wall as support to help herself stand up. The door opened again, and this time the slave trader nudged a broom at her and directed her up the stairs where the main deck was. It was already night, the stars shining above her from the darkened sky. The wind had picked up and it was cold. No one was present, and she was instructed to clean the deck. Her hair was a tangled mess down her back, and she hadn't bathed in a few days. She didn't even know what day it was. She heard a sound behind her and turned around to find a handsome, tall man with dark eyes and long black hair entering. He wore a navy blue tunic with black pants and boots that reached his knees. "Lim bonala, có chọn là wadachi?" he asked. She pointed to the broom. "Cú là tu luôn có lý chí sư? Cú chỉ tao chí có là tu. Cho chơi đã có mùa đâu có lúc chạp ư." As he said this, the wind shifted and blew across, causing her to lose her balance. She stumbled backward and dropped the broom. As she tried to grab something to hold on to, he reached her in 3 strides and took her arm, pulling her toward him. Unknowingly, his hands touched her back and she cried out in pain. Tears shot to her eyes, her mouth wide open, gasping in pain. He tightened his hold and she let out another cry. Ya Ulika, he asked, shocked. She didn't dare tell him, and when she let out another blood-curdling sob, he let her go only to find his hands were bloody. Confused, he turned her around and moved her hair to the side to reveal her wounds on her back. Some were raw with skin hanging, while others had formed an infection with pus inside. Look the Ulinaruka, he asked. She turned back around and moved away from him. Chimolang. Bây tự xin cho có lo. Bây nữa. She lowered her face. Chị à. Rong li có ya có chị ô rong tu. Yo ô mò lo đó có. Chị của bác có. Ntxhi Laim lifted her eyes up to him. Ô nhà của thế là yun chân hai tia có ya bác của một trò có rong. Chả có bác của ta có mò của đâu lụa phê nè. Có bà bao của ya lăng tử. Before she could reply, one of the mates walked up asking for him. Ya lo. Thọ có lo đó sao hậu. Mô lưu trần kinh yun trò có thả. Ntxhi Laim's eyes widened. Ya lo. He smiled and turned to the man beside him. Cho nên mua trò của lo hông bự. Bà đây rồi nè đà. Sự chỉ bút tư là chứ. Là chua. Bông gà xế. Ô lì ya lo. The room she was brought to had a large bed with blue bedding sheets. A barrel was filled with warm water as she was instructed to stand to the side. A male servant brought in a plate of warm food and set it beside her. Then he looked up at her with gentle eyes and a smile appeared. Ipeno yelo malilo, kakachita de tenamo, sunshine, guyashon the katong chipunutun kalanamo. When he walked out, Ntxhi Laim stripped and gently lowered herself into the barrel. The warm water made her exhale deeply, but she leaned against the side for the pain was much too deep. The water caused her to relax, and she closed her eyes, feeling safe after so long. She didn't hear the footsteps that arrived at the door, and when it opened and closed, she finally stirred and woke. She looked up to find the same man from the deck standing before her. She covered herself with her arms and turned away. The room was well lit, and she knew he could see her wounds clearly now, but she would rather he see that than what she had covered up. Kahulika, he asked. She didn't answer, and she heard him walk around and knelt down before her. His eyes gazed into hers, and she saw that he was truly handsome. Kahulika, he repeated. Ntxhi Laim, she answered. Smiling, he replied, Ntxhi Laim. Jonka. Kuyan Teying. Sunshine. Kuchipun lung ting uli gyaro kan sila. Kayaku. Lung ting uli naruka. She thought long and hard. Should she tell him the truth? She bit her lower lip and then looked up at him. Kasata tao yake. Kuchi yoy tin sai kay. Kunya chia mo kumo do tin nang kapon da se. Kutaka. Kutya ku raka muche. Kuchisa uli gyaro ku. He stood and walked to the corner before he turned around and crossed his arms. Kaya lung tin sai. Si ya ya lot sai nhau đâu lú sò trong tư đâu. Oh, cái chạy ya lot sai tin sai thế lo. Cũng nói ra nếu lúc mong tua mà. Đó có tự xia. Cái hình báo sa kè ya đâu lú sò nó rong. Nhà thầu tư lung tin mua con mua trôi tu ok lại kè. Họ ya bắt có đi kè ya nhiệt xe sư. Cũng như chỉ lại ya tới ya pay đó có. Tất chỉ có có bảo hai tiền ya thông được cũng mua là tu ya oli kia là như tàu. Yeah, she replied. Cũng như chia từ mua cũng lúc mà mất sao ta là. Cũng như chỉ mua đã chuyện nhận được cũng. Thảo có bác cũng. Cũng cho lúc hai tiền cũng mà lấy bao cái xin gì. He watched her for a moment, and then he let out a deep breath. Cũng bác có vì cũng lúc xưa chỉ nhớ bỏ bao nhiêu đâu chỉ rõ. Xong mua cũng do kế rong cho là sai ok. Cũng chỉ bác có chắc nó. Thảo muốn cho chờ. Có gì muốn có cũng như muốn cũng. Ntxhi Laim's eyes darkened, and she lowered her face. Có sao chỉ bác cũng như con tới tiền lấy lo. Cũng như ôn lúc nâng khai lên nó muốn cho thấu tư. He walked to her and tilted her chin up to look at him. Mua za ok, o có thể lý ba tàu có sự. Nhà đó chị, cũng như cả ở thân trọng. Smiling, he replied, Tiền lý, tiền. He let her chin go and touched a strand of her hair. Lưng o cô tù, kết xua ya con trai, cũng mà chừng cả ta. Ntxhi Laim opened and closed her mouth, feeling unable to breathe at his words, as she watched the seriousness of his words come across his eyes. Leng wakatu. Yeah, he said as he stood and backed away to sit on the edge of the bed. Yo yi hang Ntxhi Laim. Ka hai lo hai tia ka yo ku tu si ke zi nu na mu chi mo leng ti ki tau ka. Ka sa tao ra chin da ku tia. Smiling, he answered, Ku chi sa tao ra chin tao. Ku sa tao ka se. Kana yo ku sa ke yo ba ka di da lu zi wa ka tau ti lang da ka ne chia. Chi ya la. Ka sa she ka su wa leng ti tu se ma. Ntxhi Laim didn't have to think long, and she already knew her answer. She knew that with a slave trader, she'd be given a life of pain in prison, and she wasn't ready to face that. Even with the captain here, if he were only to buy her out to save her, it would be much better than the life her stepmother had planned for her. Oli, she said after a moment, Kuleng wakatu. Jean, he said as he came toward her. He rolled his sleeves up and bent down before her. He cupped a handful of water. La, ye kupaka. Sinu na mo kuchipu ka katsa nye ishan zila. Deshi, ka yo chungyan jong hai tia, ka yo kutu. Zu chipu ka kia kuwa. Ntxhi Laim nodded as he ran the warm water over her broken skin. She sucked in a breath in pain, and he touched her face, bringing her close to him. Then he bent down and took her lips, giving her a gentle kiss. The mere action brought tears to her eyes, and she fought to steady her heart. He reached over and wiped her tears away. Yaoli yakakwa? He asked gently. She shook her head and sniffed. Shimarachi. Ku konda ke shia de ku dilu tsi pelasi. Wakacha wakata ku holo kato. Nuna, ku yakatula, ku chakaraka, oli yarakola in tautantan. But as she said this, her hands shook, and he noticed. He simply took her hands in his and smiled at her, and then he brushed her hair back and tilted her chin to look up at him. Kasala yarako katili hateluka? He asked. She looked up into his eyes. Kachisata gula. Saka. Tu zineng tu tili yo kyang tau lucia. Yamai tu panya jong ni kapu lu kela na. Tashi ku chia cho tu zineng kapawa. Sa tsi ku ye lang tu panya la pau ku tun sia ni yo chu la lon si chia la nda kin chai. Sa tsa, ma no, tu ka tu king ka jong. Ku chia lu ai tia ku chi tsang na chi na ka. Ma no ka lan chi ku li kya ta ki ka shola ka yo jong ni ku. Thầu tư ka lu sun tia lon si ta ku te tia ku ma li pau ka yin chi li. Tears filled her eyes and she began to sob. Ku pa chi nya ka tia lu jong. Smiling, he replied, Ka sa she ka pa chi nya ma. Ku ne che kisse ni de chi sa yo ku. Ka te ku u de chi shi pau ye vi li kya ka wa jong bo li na da ku. Ntxhi Laim. Ye ku kyang tao ka lu ku mo te ku yo leng king. Ntxhi cha ku ha kyang shi tao sa te li yo o ki tu she da ka. He patted her hand once, stood, and left the room. Ntxhi Laim let out the breath she was holding and wiped her tears. Ở trong này sẽ là công cụ rất tốn ý, tốn ó, với tờ sẽ sát đến đây nào, bé mà lấy sinh trí đồ lắm mà.